Hello, my name is Clark Miller, and I'm the director of the Center for Energy and Society in the College of Global Futures at Arizona State University. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to explore with you this morning one of the most important questions that I think confronts us as we think about the transition to a global carbon neutral economy over the next few decades. And that question, put simply, is as we're making investments in clean energy technologies over the next few years, what kind of investments are we also making simultaneously in the human future? And we all know that climate change is one of the gravest risks confronting humanity at present, and that it's absolutely essential that we make the transition globally to a carbon neutral economy. The challenge with that is that the cost is enormous. The International Energy Agency has estimated that it will cost something like $100 trillion over the next 3 decades to achieve a sustainable energy future. And that cost doesn't even include the sheer amount of work, labor, thinking, reorganization, reconfiguration of the global economy, the infrastructure scale out that will be required to achieve this task. And so the argument that I want to make today is that if we're going to invest $100 trillion in solving climate change, it's absolutely critical that we have to solve climate change. We also need to think about how do we achieve a greater return on that investment for humanity? How do we make a greater societal return on investment on those funds and that work that we're putting into this exercise? And a lot of people, kind of respond to this question by saying, well, isn't climate change enough? And of course, it is enough. We have to do this. There's just simply no question about that. Other people say, well, aren't we going to get a lot of co-benefits along the way? I mean, aren't clean energy technologies healthier technologies? Don't they have lower environmental impacts? Aren't we going to get co-benefits along the way like that? And of course, the answer is, in all likelihood, yes, although we have to hold the renewable energy industry to strong standards with respect to social responsibility, environmental impact. Creating a circular economy in a low carbon future is not going to be a simple task by any stretch of the imagination. And so we do have to pay a lot of attention to those issues. We will, however, get co-benefits along the way, but I'm really talking about something more. I'm talking about how do we make this $100 trillion investment an investment in improving the human future, an investment in enhancing justice, in enhancing the kinds of built environments that humanity inhabits 3 decades from now. So I want to talk about 3 goals. I want to talk about ending the link between energy and poverty, which, despite our best efforts over the past century, remains quite significant at present. I want to talk about designing cities that are, frankly, amazing, right? That are just and that are worth inhabiting, places that we want to live, places that we want to work. And then third, I want to talk about empowering equality by being smart about how we design the city of the future. So first of all, this idea of ending the energy poverty nexus. We all remember earlier this year when Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, announced to his shareholders and also to the companies, the CEOs of the companies that he and BlackRock invest in, that they planned to put the transition to a low carbon economy at the centerpiece of the $7 trillion worth of investments that they have under management. And alongside that, and I thought this was a very important statement, he said governments and the private sector must work together to pursue a transition that is both fair and just. We cannot leave behind parts of society or entire countries in developing markets as we pursue the path to a low carbon world. And the reality is that there are no two of the UN Sustainable Development Goals that are as closely intertwined as the effort to end poverty and ensure energy access, right? SDG 1, this idea that we are going to end poverty in all forms, everywhere, right? And SDG 7, this idea that everyone on the planet has a right to access modern, affordable, reliable energy supplies are tightly intertwined with one another. You know, simply for one reason, we all know that economic and social development requires energy. It has to be powered, right? We all know that you know, we need those reliable energy supplies. We all know, you know, even more importantly, right? How do you get food security? How do you get water security? How do you have good jobs without having reliable, affordable energy, right? So clean energy access is obviously critical to this idea of ending poverty for all. But the reality is that this lack of electricity or the lack of clean cooking technologies is frankly only one of many factors that link energy insecurity to economic insecurity. And in fact, this relationship is not a one-directional relationship. The reality is that the energy system, as built, designed, and organized today, systematically contributes to poverty. It makes poverty worse for many communities around the world, and not just the most poor and worst off communities, but communities in some of the wealthiest countries on the planet are worse off because of the way that we have designed the energy system. So for example, modern energy systems contribute to political corruption, human rights violations, violence, environmental injustices that disproportionately impact marginal communities, right? The high costs of energy impose severe financial and non-financial burdens on low-income households. The latest data from the United States, for example, right, indicate that the lowest income quintile, the bottom 20% in terms of income in the United States, in major cities, it costs 25% of their income to pay their electricity and natural gas utility bills, right? That doesn't even include the gasoline that they use to power their automobiles, right? 25% of their income. And in Puerto Rico, where we do work, in some remote and rural parts of the island, that number is as high as 40%, even 50% of income, right? This is a severe burden. It causes all kinds of challenges in the household. Households routinely trade off food for energy costs, causing nutritional problems. It means there's not money left over for investments in education, right? You know, it's just these high energy burdens are just enormous on these communities. And that creates, especially for the most vulnerable, situations in which energy systems end up extracting resources and degrading capabilities of these households rather than creating value and opening up opportunities for them, right? The fact that you're embedded in an economy where you have no choice but to have energy, but you have infrastructures, for example, that are poorly designed for it, right? We have households here in Phoenix, low-income households in Phoenix that pay energy bills that are equivalent to some of the wealthiest households in town, despite the fact that their housing infrastructure, for example, is 1/3 the size, right? In an environment in which air conditioning that housing infrastructure is the primary cost, right? And that happens because those families, either because they're renting, don't own the property, or even if they own the property, they don't have the money to invest in higher efficiency equipment, to invest in insulation in the walls, right? And so their air conditioning bills are just exorbitant as a result of that, right? And this becomes extractive, right? It drains resources from those communities to have to pay those energy bills. So we see that there are a whole variety of complex feedback loops when we look in detail between energy insecurity, economic insecurity, and human insecurity. I won't go into these in details, but we call this the energy poverty nexus. And it is a major challenge because it means the challenge is not just to bring energy to poor communities, which is the way we framed SDG 7. SDG 7 in that sense is wholly inadequate to providing a basis, not only for really doing what it wants to do, but for allowing SDG 7 to really become a driver of sustainable development across the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. Here's another example from Puerto Rico. You can see from these two maps, which are the percent of low-income households in a municipality and the location of the last 30,000 households that were reconnected after Hurricane Maria. These households were connected over 11 months after Hurricane Maria destroyed the energy infrastructure of the island. And you had unbelievably difficult circumstances in those communities for those 11 months. And these were already the most vulnerable, already the least well-off communities in Puerto Rico. They contributed approximately 1/3 of the lost hours of electricity service in the event. And so you see that feedback loop happening, right? Already poor communities are now suffering from months and months of extra time in which they don't have electricity service for a variety of reasons. And in fact, the circumstances are not a whole lot better today. I have a PhD student who's from one of these remote mountain communities that was one of the last reconnected. And she went home this summer to be with her family during the COVID-19 crisis. Multiple times a month, multiple day energy outages. That also meant that you didn't have running water in the community, that you didn't have communications in the community, right? It just exacerbates poverty when you have these kinds of situations. So in order to end the energy poverty nexus, we really have to shift up our thinking about how we're going to approach energy investments going forward. We have to make sure that the energy system that we design for the middle of the 21st century also serves the bottom 10% of our populations universally across the world. And by that, I don't mean delivers electricity to them. I mean helps those communities get out of poverty. We have to find ways to disrupt these negative feedback loops between energy insecurity and economic insecurity. We have to find ways to replace extractive systems with generative alternatives. And we have to find ways to grow capabilities in these communities, grow value in these communities, and grow opportunity in these communities. So we've been working around 3 ideas. The first of those is to adopt what we call a human-centered approach. One of the challenges that we have in this space is that predominantly the people who do energy policy and energy development have historically been electrical engineers. I'm an electrical engineer, right? And we're trained to design energy technologies that deliver amazing electricity. Well, that's great. The challenge is, what do you do with that electricity, right? What do you do with the energy that's delivered? How do you transform that energy into meaningful and productive work that creates value for the community? Well, to do that, you have to understand the circumstances that the people are in, the context that the people are in, the kinds of economic opportunities that they have available to them, right? So you have to take this human-centered approach to design that's really about thinking about how are these individuals going to be able to use energy in order to create value for themselves, right? This is really the idea. This idea of value creation, really the central idea of the concept of lean startup, right? but even more so, it's a concept of any meaningful business plan, right? How are you going to create value for your customers? Because if you create value for your customers, they'll buy your service, right? If you're creating more value for them, then it costs them to get what you're selling. Then they'll happily not only buy it, they'll come back. Not only that, they'll recommend it to their neighbors, right? And to their fellow businessmen and women, right? And so you get this cycle of value creation in which the more you provide, in this case, electricity, the more electricity you provide, the more value is created in the community, the more that community has money that they can then use not only to pay back for the investment in the energy system in the first place, but to reinvest, to grow that energy system, to enable it to do more, to support them in more effective ways. This was the model for building the electric utility, for building the oil industry in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, right? Do more value for your customers than it costs to deliver that energy to them, right? But remarkably, we seem to have gotten out of the business of thinking about, especially in these low-income communities, how they're going to actually create value with the energy that they use. And so the third piece of this is really to catalyze grassroots energy innovation. We have to get the creativity and the knowledge of the communities themselves engaged in the question of how to put an energy future in place that will serve them. They're the ones who understand what the economic and social development needs of the community are. They're the ones who are understand what the economic opportunities are for them. They're the ones that understand what will be productive for them. And so we've been working very closely, not only with communities themselves, but also with small renewable energy project providers all over the world: Philippines, Nepal, Uganda, Bolivia, Sierra Leone, Puerto Rico, right? To help these project developers take this kind of human-centered value creation, grassroots energy innovation approach and build up the capacity of these communities to collaborate with them in the design of energy systems that truly work on behalf of the communities to help them create the kinds of outcomes of economic activity, of social development, of community welfare that are really beneficial outcomes of energy investments. So, I think there's a real opportunity here to truly do what we set out to do 100 years ago, which was to make energy available for everyone and to have that be a driver of well-being for everyone. So the second thing I want to talk about is this idea of designing cities that are amazing, right? Designing cities that are just, that are inclusive, and that are worth inhabiting, right? Cities are the human future. By 2030, Africa will add 1 billion new urban residents to the planet, right? By 2050, the United Nations estimates that 7 out of 10 people on the planet will live in cities. Right? So the question of how we build cities is really the question of how we build the places that the people of Earth will live, will work, will hopefully thrive, will hopefully be healthy, will find themselves prosperous, right? This is really the challenge for us. And it's really the promise of modern energy, right? Has always been the creation of equality and prosperity of all, and the creation of cities that would provide that, right? Henry Ford and the automobile, the idea of electricity being too cheap to meter, the idea of the Tennessee Valley Authority being the advancement of democracy through the creation of public power, right? This really was the promise of early energy innovation, was to create futures that for all of us were worth living. And a key part of that right, was to create the city of the future, right? These, of course, are images from the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, which, was this great exhibition. And at the centerpiece of that exhibition was the idea that electricity was going to do amazing things to not just light up the city, but really to power the future of these amazing places to live. And in some sense, of course, it has, right? It was also the vision of Henry Ford, right? To create a form of transportation and a way of making that transportation that was so inexpensive that everyone could afford it, right? It was this vision of not just equality, right, but really liberty, liberty to move around the world, that drove, the kind of machinery of the Ford Motor Company in the early days, right? But unfortunately, we all know the result, right? I mean, many of the world's cities are, of course, do vastly better on all sorts of metrics than they did historically. But of course, in other ways, they leave a great deal to be desired. Let's just put it that way, right? Cities are hotspots in local air pollution in many parts of the world that create all kinds of health challenges for people. Of course, we've created cities that sprawl enormously, right? That are giant asphalt and concrete meccas that have traffic snarls on a daily basis, except, of course, if you're having a global pandemic. But I don't see any reason to imagine that a year from now, we're not going to be back in exactly the same situation that we were before, because the infrastructure is exactly the same as we had before, right? We created cookie cutter neighborhoods. The concrete and asphalt that I talked about is driving urban heat island effects that are creating heat waves in our cities, exacerbated by climate change, that are driving all kinds of problems, right? And, of course, this was not the intention, right? But these are the kinds of things that, as we think about the kinds of infrastructure investments that we're going to make with $100 trillion to create the clean energy economy of the future, these are the kinds of things that I think we have to grapple with in terms of assessing what kinds of futures do we want to build when we build the future of the city, right? And so, from my perspective, fortunately, we have this chance to have a do-over, right? And the reason is because the energy transition is not just a switch in fuels, right? The energy transition is a profound transformation of the core techno-human systems that underpin modern cities and societies and economies, right? The electricity system, the transportation system, the finance system, the manufacturing system, agriculture, food, water, communication, all of these are bound up in the energy transition. We're not just talking about taking a power plant off the electricity grid over here and putting a different one over here, right? We're really talking about reimagining the relationship between arguably the circulatory system of the global economy, right? The energy infrastructures, the energy systems that power the global economy. We're going to reconstruct the relationship between those things and the economy itself, and the society that we've built on top of the economy. All of that is at stake in the future of this energy transition. And so we need to think about it, right, as a redesign of all of those things, not just a redesign of a few energy technologies, right? So here's why, right? When we built, this is a cartoon image from a storybook, a kid's storybook from the 1950s by an author, Richard Scarry. This is from What Do People Do All Day? He wrote another one called Cars and Trucks and Things That Go, right? And these were, in some sense, right, the introduction for kids to the way that our techno-human relationships were evolving, in the middle of the 20th century, right? And so, you know, on the previous page, you have the coal mine. So you have the coal workers, the people who are putting the coal on the train, the coal mine owners. On this page, you have the people who are taking the coal off the train, moving it up the elevator into the power plant, into the boiler room. You have the boiler room worker. You have the substation manager who's managing the electricity traveling to the house. Of course, you have this house that's been transformed by the introduction of electricity. We have television, we have electric vacuums and electric stoves and electric toasters and electric barbecues, right? When we invented the electricity system, it was not just a change in our energy technologies. It was a reworking of our entire society, right? I mean, I like to remind people, General Electric, the same company that brought you the system in this picture, in all of its many facets, also invented the television, and they invented the radio, right? They invented modern communication technologies. Modern 24/7, 365 culture was built on the back of this electricity system. So when we undertake these fundamental energy transitions, we are also undertaking the fundamental reconfiguration of our societies and our cities, right? Never forget that the invention of electricity was the invention of the electric city, right? They went hand in hand together. The city being the product of our modern energy systems, and in turn driving those modern energy systems in the directions that they've taken. So as we reinvent those energy systems, we truly are talking about the opportunity to fundamentally redesign the cities of tomorrow. There's this amazing group called the Land Art Generator Initiative. They hold design competitions, have for the last decade, with major cities in which they ask competitors, and they get some of the biggest design firms in the world, some of the most amazing thinkers in the world to participate in these competitions. And they ask them to design public art as centerpieces for urban futures. Here's the key though, that public art has to generate a lot of electricity, right? And the goal is to demonstrate that, that our power plants don't have to be the ugliest things in our urban landscapes, right? That our power plants can in fact be amazingly beautiful contributions to urban communities, to urban spaces, to urban living, right? And so this is kind of the opportunity that is in front of us, is to really think about how we redesign the future of our cities as we rebuild the energy infrastructures that support them. And of course, we can't forget this question of for whom are we doing this, right? That the challenge is not to build amazing cities for the rich, but to build amazing cities that truly support everyone, right? So how do we do that? Well, one of the things we've been working with is simply the idea of catalyzing the imagination, like these design competitions that the Land Art Generator holds, right? We need to find ways to think about what these futures might be, not just for the city, right? And these design futures, amazing architectural designs, but what about the people who are inhabiting those? So what we've been doing is working with engineers, with social scientists, with artists, and most importantly, with speculative fiction writers, people who write about the future, who write about the people of the future in new technological environments. We've been putting them on interdisciplinary teams and getting them to build worlds, right? Imagine different ways that you might build cities powered by solar energy in the future, right? Write stories, collaboratively write stories about the people who live in those solar powered cities of the future, and then reflect on those stories in essays. We compile all of that together, the artwork, the stories, the essays that people write in what we're calling these collections of solar futures. Cities of Light is the second of these. The first is The Weight of Light. You can go look it up on the internet, but the idea is really spark the imagination of what's possible and then explore what the reality of that possibility is likely to be for the people who inhabit it. So these are not, some magical description of some depopulated future, right? These are efforts to take a realistic look at what the future might bring, but also what might be possible in the future in designing cities that work better for people. As part of that, we believe it's critical to embrace technological flexibility. The solar panel is one of these amazing technologies that you can use in literally thousands of different ways, right? Already on the planet, we deploy with viable business models solar panels in scales that range from watts in a solar calculator or a solar watch, solar powered watch, right? All the way up to gigawatts, 9 orders of magnitude in scale difference. And all of them, fully functional in terms of market models, right? At the moment, fully competitive. And that size variability is only one of the many ways in which solar energy is flexible. And so we've developed a set of about 9 or 10 different design variables on which solar energy is flexible and which we have choices. And I really think it's critical to us that we not imagine that the solar future is one thing, right? That we get away from this mentality, in fact, that solar energy is a commodity, right? And really think about how do we leverage the amazing flexibility of solar technologies, some of these other low carbon renewable energy technologies, to really integrate them into our lives in a wide variety of different kinds of ways, so that we can be creative about how we power and design the future of the city, both technically and socioeconomically. And as part of that, right, we also can take advantage of the fact that we can transform energy from a single function system energy to a multi-function system, right? A system in which the energy infrastructure that we build does lots of different things for us. We have this amazing shade structure at Arizona State University that sits over our central plaza on campus. It's about a 50% shade structure, right? So solar panels cover 50% of the area. The other 50% is open. The plants underneath that shade structure love it, right? We have such an unbelievably unrelenting sunlight in the summer here in Arizona that it's destructive to the ability of plants to live. But if you put a 50% shade structure overhead, they love it, right? The people love it too, because you reclaim this space for additional months of the year where it's possible to sit outside, have conversations with your friends, your colleagues, and so forth, right? So solar panels can be multifunctional in that sense. And that, of course, is the purpose of the agrivoltaics innovation that's going on in the bottom right-hand picture here, is this idea that you can integrate actually photovoltaics into agricultural lands in highly productive ways. That's even made better when you don't just put a commodity solar panel up there, but you design that solar panel to take advantage of the things that it can take advantage of, which include adjusting the spectrum associated with it, right? Filtering the light that comes down to the plants, optimizing that for the plants that you have underneath, optimizing the heat properties. So whether it's collecting heat and re-radiating it in the area or reflecting it back into the sky. Aesthetics, as you see in one of these land art generator images, again, in the ball on the left, is another one of these functions. And so, we really take advantage of the ability to design energy systems that can do many, many, many different kinds of things. Now let me go on to this third idea, right? Which is that in the process of doing all of this amazing design of cities and really aiming to end the linkages between energy and poverty, I think that we can also tackle this goal of really empowering equality through smart energy system design. And I don't necessarily mean smart data systems here. I just mean being intelligent about how we approach investments in the clean energy future. You know, we live in a world in which inequality is growing. We live in a world in which inequality is driving conflict. It's creating challenges like climate change induced migration, right? And I think that we really have to think about how, as we do our investments in the future of infrastructure and of cities, we need to think about how we leverage those investments to really reduce global inequalities, right? Today's cities are at one and the same time the world's primary energy consumers, but of course also therefore the drivers of climate change, but they are also its chief victims. You know, we see that in the United States right now. We have a hurricane pounding cities along the Gulf Coast of the United States, and at the same time we have fires in California and Oregon and Washington that are burning towns. You know, climate change is really confronting us with unprecedented extreme weather risks and challenges at the moment. And of course, you know, those challenges that we're facing are not falling equally on everybody. They're falling most heavily on the most vulnerable in our societies, right? And that's part of what's exacerbating global inequalities, right? But it's not the only thing, right? And it's also unfortunately true that historically we have built infrastructure in the world, all over the world, with explicit designs to create inequality. This is a freeway in Baltimore that was, you know, I mean, this picture, it exemplifies the challenge in some sense. It was designed to go nowhere, right? And it goes nowhere. And so very few people ever drive on it, right? But where was it located? It was located in the heart of a vibrant African-American community at the end of World War II. In fact, one of the most vibrant social and economic communities for African Americans in the country. This infrastructure was built right down the middle of it, right? As an instrument of racial and social division, right? And so I really hate to think that as we enter the second half of the 21st century, that we discover either by accident or by design, that the way that we have built out the renewable energy infrastructure of the future has in fact exacerbated inequality in our cities and inequality between cities and the rural communities that surround them, as opposed to the opposite, which is to really drive equality, to power equality for all, right? And part of the way we have to think about this, in my mind, is we have to recognize that markets aren't just markets. That markets have designs to them. They've always had designs to them, right? And so I want to illustrate that with these three pictures, which are of course identical, of solar panels in the Arizona desert on rooftops. And point out that, in fact, we have already in Arizona 3 different markets with 3 different designs for how these solar panels are integrated into our socioeconomic landscape, right? Remember I said that technology, that flexibility of solar panels is not just technical, right? It's also socioeconomic. Here's the example of that. So in the left-hand column, you see that we have a set of homeowners who own their homes. They function in a peer-to-peer market model where they can share electricity. I'm exaggerating a little bit with regard to what's possible at the moment, but we certainly imagine that this might be possible in the future, that it's a very individualist political economy. It's the kind of political economy we like here in Arizona. It's a very libertarian place where a lot of people here support the idea that every household is an independent economic actor and ought to, be able to participate in markets in that kind of way. It's a highly decentralized kind of market model. Right? In the middle, we have a model that has really been driven by folks like Solar City, now it's part of Tesla, right? It's a rental model market. So these homeowners, or perhaps their renters, don't own these homes. Sorry, they don't own the solar panels. Instead, the solar panels are owned by Tesla. And the space on the rooftop is rented. In order to be able to put these solar panels down, right? Musk's model here is really to own every rooftop solar system in America, to create the largest electric utility in the country by renting people's rooftops and essentially paying them a small part of the fraction, of the revenue stream that comes from selling the electricity involved in these systems, right? And so, the net ultimately economic benefits of selling solar electricity in the left-hand picture and in the middle picture are exactly the same. Same amount of electricity being generated, same amount of electricity being sold. But the market design is different in the sense that different players are getting the benefits of those revenue streams that are coming out. And of course, in the third column, you can imagine we also have some community solar models. You can imagine neighborhoods that gather together to strengthen their buying power, be able to reduce the cost of the systems that they're buying by buying in bulk. And then you could actually have a community cooperative that owned all of those panels, that shared revenue equally, right? The challenge with the picture on the left over here is that if you don't own your home, or you don't have the money to invest in the solar panels up front, you can't participate in this market model. But in the picture on the right, the whole community can participate at whatever level they're able to afford to buy into this membership system, right? So it's a more of a sharing economy model, right? But you realize these market designs are fundamentally different. Even though we haven't moved the solar panels a single bit, we haven't changed how much energy they're producing at all, right? In that sense, they're identical, but the market models are different, and they have different revenue streams, different benefits for the different participants in those markets. And that's really the flexibility that we have the opportunity to leverage to create a different kind of future for our cities and particularly for our low-income communities. So let me end up by talking about three solutions here for this final space. The first is create inclusive electrification. Electrification is the mantra now for the energy system for everybody. Electrify everything, electrify as much as you can, right? Take energy end uses that we used to drive with fuel, natural gas or diesel, whatever, right? And transform those into electricity generated systems, right? Electric heat pumps, electric furnaces, and so forth, right? The idea being that this is crucial to powering the global economy with renewable electricity, is just to use that electricity directly for all of these end uses. The challenge is that we have an enormous array of low-income communities around the world that at the moment depend on fuel, not on electricity, right? And that don't have the money to undertake this transformation of electrification, that really don't have the resources, the capital to invest in this. And that creates two challenges. One, it's a direct reference to what Larry Fink was talking about in that quote at the beginning of my conversation with you here, right? He was saying we can't afford to leave people behind, right? And it's very possible that as we undertake electrification, if we don't do it in a smart way, if we don't do it in an inclusive way, we will do it in a way that leaves all kinds of people behind in this effort. But the second problem is that as a result, there will still be all kinds of carbon emissions that come from these communities. We have to find a way to get low-income households electrified in an inclusive fashion and in a way that doesn't disrupt them, right? Create more economic insecurity for these communities. This is a huge challenge that we have to really, really focus on as we move forward. Because right now, one of our major strategies for doing this is to provide people with tax credits, right? And tax credits simply don't cut it in terms of creating inclusive futures. They drive change at the wealthiest levels first, and then at the middle income levels, and they rarely accomplish change at the lowest income levels in society. So the second thing we got to do is think differently about energy ownership. I mean, frankly, ownership in the energy industries of the last 100 years has been part of the problem of wealth inequality. Energy system ownership is highly concentrated, and it takes wealth from the world's poor and moves it up the income stream. That's what I mean by the word extractive, right? And so we really have to think about, as we move forward, how do we diversify and distribute energy ownership so that energy ownership, right? Ownership of energy assets, not only ownership of the, I mean, so that we're really thinking about how do we drive not only ownership of your own energy producing assets, right? So that you're internalizing those costs and getting them at the lowest cost possible. But more importantly, that you're deriving revenue streams, you're deriving jobs from the creation of locally owned, locally sourced energy. Now, I like to remind people that around the world, there are many, many parts of the world that are not energy generators at the moment. They're energy consumers, right? And Arizona is one of those places. Puerto Rico is one of those places, right? Where we spend enormous amounts of money every year that we send out of our economies to buy carbon. We get the carbon and we set it on fire. Right? It's an amazing cycle, right? It's an annual tax, essentially, on our local economies. In Arizona, it's $15 billion a year. It's a 5% tax on the Arizona economy to buy carbon and set it on fire. So if you think about what happens, if instead you have locally sourced, locally owned energy supplies that you're investing in with that money every year when you're buying electricity, right? Then what you get is a 5% annual investment in your economy as opposed to a 5% tax. The differences in terms of economic growth at any scale. I mean, I'm doing this at the level of a state, right? But you could also do it at the level of a community or a neighborhood, whatever, right? At any level, the opportunity here is to transform our economies from ones in which energy is taking money out of those economies to one in which energy is driving reinvestment in those economies. That's this idea of generativity, right? And that's this idea that I think we have an opportunity here to really leverage energy transitions and think about how we distribute and diversify ownership of energy in those transitions around the globe to really drive a more equal set of outcomes. So just my final observation here would be to say that the coming energy transition is a unique opportunity to build a more inclusive and thriving future for humanity. We can put our $100 trillion worth of investments in a clean energy future, not only to build a global low carbon economy that we must have to address climate change, but also, and more importantly, to build a better future for the people of planet Earth. Let's not miss this opportunity. Thank you very much.